Welcome to the Steel Scorpion Sports Week 4 podcast. I'm half your hosting team, Jeff Miller, here with the founder of Steel Scorpion Sports, Mark Heflin. Evening, Hef.
Good evening, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm looking forward to doing a little more talking about football, fantasy football, some interesting tidbits that you picked up from the Field of Genes, Levi Stadium, and also to take a look at our multipliers, our best and worst of the weeks, and our quarter point review now that we're a full quarter of the way through the season. But I think we should start tonight, Monday night, with the results of the Monday Night Football game. I know this time you were able to sit back, relax, and enjoy a football game in its entirety, so why don't you give us your thoughts from Patriots at Chiefs?
Well, I was able to watch most of the game. I don't necessarily agree with being able to enjoy the game. It wasn't that enjoyable game, except from the standpoint, I guess, if you're a Patriots fan, you might have liked it, or if you're a diehard Chiefs fan. But the game itself wasn't that exciting. It was 17-0 at halftime, and by mid-third quarter, you could easily tell that the Patriots were not coming back. But I was starting to think the Patriots might actually not be very good. They're 2-2. They lost at Miami, who is just kind of an average team, I think. They got blown out tonight at the Chiefs. Again, I think they're a decent team. I don't think they're anything special. Their 2 wins at the Vikings right after Adrian Peterson, the whole thing broke, and he was suspended for that game, and they had no chance to adjust their game plan without him because it happened on a Friday afternoon. And then Castle threw 4 picks. And then they won at home versus Oakland in Week 3. It was a close game. It was 16-9. The Raiders almost tied it, or actually did tie it. They got a call back on the penalty. And you have strange results every now and then in the NFL, and kind of just, throw it out like, okay, it's just a bad matchup or a bad day or whatever. But I think now that we're taking the 4 weeks of the results, it's looking like the Patriots aren't very good. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to have to tend to agree with you. It's odd. Going into the year, all the talk was this Patriots team is going to be better than last year. The weapons are going to be better for Brady. The defense is back to what Belichick used to build in the early 2000s, back when they were winning 3 Super Bowls. And I think they were kind of the in vogue pick to come out of the AFC, even ahead of Denver. At this point, I can still say they'll likely win the AFC East. They have as good a shot as anybody, and those teams, Buffalo just replaced their quarterback today. They're going to Kyle Orton. That's never a winning strategy. As you said, Miami average. I don't know if the New York Jets at 1-3 can really come back and challenge. At some point, Geno may be benched for Michael Vick. That won't be a winning scenario. So by default, they may still make the playoffs because someone has to win the division. But instead of going in as a hot 1 or 2 seed and having a shot at the Super Bowl, they may well be the home team that gets upset in the first round in the wild card round of the playoffs.
Yeah, I think that could happen. They're not playing very well. I think at this point, the AFC East might be the worst division in football when you look at those teams. The 1-3 Jets, and as everyone knows, quarterback is the most important position not only in football but probably in all of sports. And look at the Jets. Geno Smith, not very good. He's struggling. I'm thinking of should we put in Michael Vick? The Bills, as you mentioned, they're already pulling their first-round draft pick from next year, putting in Kyle Orton. And I actually, the diehard Bills fan today, I was saying, well, maybe you guys can just tank for the rest of the year and get, someone like Mariota next year in the draft. At which point you reminded me they don't have a first-round pick next year because they traded up with the Browns to get Watkins. So that's even more depressing if you're a Bills fan. That not only are you pulling manual for Kyle Orton, you don't even have a chance to get a first-round QB next year. So that's pretty dire there. And then Miami looks okay. I would actually give Miami a 15 to 20% chance of winning that division at this point. After watching tonight's game, I thought back to the podcast we recorded the day before. We're guessing the lines for Week 5, and the Chiefs play at the Niners in Week 5. That line opened at 7.5. Thinking that might drop a little bit. That might drop below the key number of 7. Might drop down to 6.5. The Chiefs looks pretty good tonight. Conversely, the Patriots are at home, Sunday night primetime game next week against the 3-0 Bengals. That line opened up as Patriots as a 3-point favorite. I think that's going to get closer to a pick-em because the Bengals have looked pretty good and have a full week of rest. If the Patriots lose that, they could fall to 2-3.
Yeah, I don't think anyone saw that coming. But since this is the NFL, I'll go out on a limb right now and say somehow the Patriots will pull it together and beat the Bengals. because, of course, after you look horrible on Monday Night Football, can't move the ball against the Chiefs, you've looked mediocre at best all season, of course you'll beat an undefeated team. That's just the way the NFL goes. Dun, 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 dun. We have breaking news, Mark. Dennis Allen has been fired. The Raiders, as is their wont, have fired another head coach, but they have not named an interim replacement. They are going to hold a news conference tomorrow to do so. That sounds very Oakland Raider-ish to me.
Yeah, the funny thing was Twitter was abuzz yesterday saying that Dennis Allen had been fired, and was kind of making the rounds. And then all of a sudden, the guy who tweeted that out deleted his Twitter account and said, "Okay, wait, no, it's not confirmed." And then, as you just said, it did happen this evening. He actually did get canned. I think we could all see this coming when he was 8-28 with the Raiders. But that franchise, man, I feel bad for Raiders fans because they've been bad for quite a long time, and it may be bad for a while. They just don't seem to have a good plan in place. I don't think that Derek Carr is the answer at QB. Maybe something better, but they just don't. They have no running backs. Look at McFadden, Maurice Jones-Drew, even the receivers. It's just some average guys. They don't have anyone. I think back just a few years ago when they did Darius Hayward-Bay above Michael Crabtree. And Crabtree's pretty good. He hasn't turned out to be an all-pro or anything, but he's leaps and bounds ahead of Darius Hayward-Bay. So it could be a long while before we see the Raiders back in the playoffs.
Yeah, so from a Chiefs perspective, Monday night was a beautiful night. They win a huge Monday Night Football game against the Patriots at home, and then they watch as one of their rivals, the Oakland Raiders, cans another head coach. I'm not sure Monday night can get much better for them. And Kansas City has a baseball game tomorrow as well, so heady days in the Kansas City sports scene.
Yes, very big weekend for Kansas City sports fans. As you mentioned, the Royals have broke the streak of the 29 straight years, which is the longest playoff drought of any of the four major sports. Makes me want to know who the new team is. It's been the longest. You got to figure at some point the Raiders may get there. At this point, the Bills could get back to the playoffs at some point before the Raiders do. The Raiders haven't been, I think, since their Super Bowl year, which was quite a while ago. You know who the biggest rumored name is going to be for the Raiders is John Gruden. That name comes up for almost any coaching search, whether NFL or college, but especially now that the Raiders position is open. John Gruden is going to be the popular name that we hear.
Not John Madden?
Well, for the Raider fans, I'm sure they'll float it out there, but no, I think it's safe to say that he's done coaching.
But be that as it may, good recap from the Monday night affairs and a little breaking news for you here on the podcast. But why don't we jump in and have you give us a description? I'm very eager to learn how impressive this Levi's Stadium, the so-called Field of Jeans in Santa Clara, is. State-of-the-art, I believe $1.2 billion stadium, built in California. And as we both live in California, we know it's nearly impossible to get anything built in California. So why don't you give us your first impressions and maybe some tidbits from the game?
I'll give a quick recap on the stadium first. It's a nice stadium, as you expect for $1.2 billion. It's got two really nice, huge, big scoreboards, as any new stadium these days must have. It's got much better food options than Candlestick or whatever it was being called at the time. Attended a couple Niners games there within the past few years. And it's so good that they got rid of that place. It was old. It was run down. The concourses are about 3 feet wide, I think, and I'm only exaggerating by just a little bit. There's very narrow concourses. So the new stadium is, much bigger, much nicer, much newer, all that. The game was an interesting game. The Eagles' high-flying offense decided not to show up. But it was still an exciting game nonetheless. When you're watching football, you like to see big, exciting plays. This game had that. It had a blocked punt for a touchdown. It had an interception return for a touchdown. It had a punt return for a touchdown. All of those coming from the Eagles. And at one point, halfway through the second quarter, I looked at the scoreboard. The Eagles were ahead 21-10, despite only having 2 first downs and 47 yards of offense. So it was all from the special teams. It was good to see some of those big plays. A couple things that I noted during the game that struck me as odd or kind of question the decision. The first drive Eagles had, the Eagles took the ball first. They had a 3rd and 1 play, and they ran it, and they converted it. And Harbaugh threw his challenge flag, and the Eagles are at the 30-yard line. The They took the ball at the 20. They converted 31. They're at the 30-yard line. So we're talking, maybe 2 minutes into the game. Harbaugh decides to throw a challenge flag to challenge the spot. I guess because he wants to hold them and say that it's 4th and 1 that they have to punt. Seems like a very odd use of a challenge to me. Those things are pretty valuable. And the spot of the ball is so hard as well. I mean, I don't see that changed too often. Sure enough, he lost the challenge. Eagles had the first down. And it was a wasted challenge anyway, because then they held him and forced him to punt from that same spot anyway. So that was very strange to me. But the game was exciting. Didn't particularly care who won. Either way, as you're sitting there in the game, you kind of end up rooting for the home team, just for the crowd. But good game overall, but just a very weird game. The Niners' time of possession was 42 minutes and 17 seconds, which is just crazy. I'll go out on a limb and say that will be one of the top 2 or 3 time of possession times that we will see this entire season. Whatever Harbaugh said, the fire troops worked, and it was kind of a must-win for the Niners. They couldn't afford to fall to 1-3. They got the win. Now they're 2-2, and now they're still in the thick of the playoff chase.
Yeah, so there are 2 things I want to mention there. There was some crazy talk going around the internet and Twitter prior to that game that rumored if Harbaugh lost that game, he may lose his job. That seems ridiculous to me, but you're up in the Bay Area, so maybe you've heard those rumors and had a better sense of that, because that would have seemed just terribly crazy to me that the Raiders and the Niners could both be looking to get rid of coaches, especially when one of them is coming off 3 straight NFC Championship game appearances.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's crazy. Jim Harbaugh's record in the NFL is 38, 13, and 1. And like you said, he's been to at least the conference championship game for all 3 years that he's been there. He's a hell of a coach. If he were to get fired, there's probably about half the teams in the league that would be willing to fire their current coach and hire Jim Harbaugh. So, yeah, it's pretty crazy on people talking about him getting fired this season. I cannot see that happening.
But let's get back to the stadium itself. So, how was the crowd? Were they sipping their Sonoma wines? Were they eating their cheese on little toothpicks while the game was going on? Were there sushi rolls being thrown if a bad call happened? I'm really curious about all that.
There is definitely some of that. As you said, there is some high-class food. There's seafood. There's panini station. There's some upscale sandwiches and wraps. And there's a tap room. There's all kinds of beer. There's different wines that they have. Of course, we're in Napa Valley, so there has to be different wine selections. They've got the different peel-off wines that are in a glass. And so you have some of that, but then, of course, you also have, it's a football game, so you have your mixture of rowdy young fans that are there as well. So you have some of the older upper-class people that are just sitting in their seat and just want to be entertained for a few hours, and you've got the people that are demanding that everybody stand up and cheer and be fired up. And so, yeah, kind of a mixture as you might expect. But the stadium itself, very nice.
All right, so $1.2 billion well spent. So with that, why don't we turn our attention back to the fantasy football action, now that we've had the good recap of the game you saw, the Monday night game, and the stadium itself. And what I was hoping we could do, Mark, is now that we're a quarter of the way through the season, let's go back and look at the first round of our multiplier draft and evaluate whether or not those players have performed up to expectations, if they're busts completely, if they've outperformed, and then maybe throw a few in from later rounds that we might consider, say, the MVP of fantasy after 4 weeks, and maybe the most disappointing players after 4 weeks.
Yeah, it sounds good. So I have the first round pulled up here in front of me. I will protect the innocent. I won't say, which teams within our league selected each of these players, but we'll just go through 1 through 12. And I guess as I read the list, I'll name the player, and you can chime in as far as whether or not you think that this player has performed up to the value that you'd expect from this position. So at 1.1, we had LaShawn McCoy.
I'd say you're disappointed if you own LaShawn McCoy right now. He hasn't performed even up to last year's standards. You're still hopeful. It's a high-powered offense. He's not injured. Things probably will turn around. They've had a couple interesting matchups, like you said this week. San Francisco game, it just played out so strangely. That's hurt his value a little too from the first 4 games. But I'd have to say no. I'd be a little disappointed that I took LaShawn McCoy 1 overall after 4 weeks and really haven't had a great performance. And you?
Yeah, I agree. I'd say you'd be disappointed through 4 weeks, but at the same time, I think that you still have optimism. I think he's still one of the best running backs and one of the best offenses. And I wouldn't be worrying too much at this point, but yeah, through 4 weeks, a little disappointed. At pick 1.2, I don't think we need to spend a whole lot of time on this. It's an unfortunate situation, but Adrian Peterson, obviously, you're not happy with this pick.
No, I don't think you can be terribly happy about Adrian Peterson. You got one game, and it wasn't even a great game, and then nothing for the rest of the year. Probably pretty disappointed. So move on to number 3.
At 1.3, we have Matt Forte.
I think you'd be pretty happy with Matt Forte at this point. He's giving you a couple really good games. He's performing as expected, hasn't been injured. Again, that's a key with your first round pick. You want him on the field. So I would say you're about getting what you expected out of Matt Forte.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say at this point that you're fairly satisfied with Matt Forte, especially coming off a good game that he had in week 4. He's a workhorse, so I think you're still looking to have a good season out of him. At 1.4, I'll stick to this one because I will come to the fact that this was my team. I took Eddie Lacy at the 4th pick. Maybe, slightly controversial. I took him ahead of Jamal Charles. The Kansas City Chiefs offensive line was rebuilt, and Eddie Lacy is younger and a really good offense. Just had a feeling he was going to be in for a good year, but I got to tell you, through 4 weeks, especially after seeing Jamal Charles tonight, I would obviously, if I could go back, I would take Jamal Charles instead. But maybe Eddie Lacy will still turn it around this year, but at this point, not looking good.
No, I have to imagine you're disappointed. There is a silver lining. The Packers have played the Seahawks, the Jets, the Lions, who seem to know them pretty well. In the last 2 games that they've played, actually been pretty low scoring. And then this week, well, they played at the Bears. He didn't get on track yet, but you figure he's played probably the tougher defenses they'll face. So maybe he gets it going. So you still could have a little optimism, but yeah, he's progressing down the bust path as we speak.
Yes, unfortunately so. And then 1.5, I already mentioned Jamal Charles. Kind of a mixed bag. I mean, he missed the game with an injury, and but tonight, obviously, 3 touchdowns, a lot of yardage. If he's back to his normal self, I think you're pretty satisfied with that pick at this point.
I think you're optimistic. Now, remember, week 1, he didn't have a good performance either in the game that they opened the season with Tennessee, and they got annihilated, so he didn't have as many chances to run. Week 3 was the game he missed against Miami. So you really have 2 weeks where you didn't get anything out of him. One of them you played him and got nothing out of him, so that's disappointing. But you're right, after tonight's game against New England, you feel like he's back towards the Jamal Charles of last year, so you're optimistic, but you're probably a little disappointed through 4 weeks.
Yes, and then at 1.6 we have Jimmy Graham.
I think you're happy you have the best tight end in football, but I also think he hasn't been so overwhelmingly dominant that it's been a game changer the way you might have thought it would be. So you're probably not as happy as you thought you would be.
Yeah, I would agree. I think you're a little bit disappointed. The Saints offense just hasn't looked good so far this year. That they've played 4 games, and 3 of the 4 have been on the road. Now, as we all know, the Saints are a different team between home and road. So, given the fact that 3 of the first 4 have been on the road, obviously the majority of the remaining games will be at home. So they're happy about that at least. You're more likely to get some good production out of Jimmy Graham when he's at home. But yeah, it's been kind of a mixed bag so far, and you're certainly hoping that the Saints offense will get back on track. And then at 1.7, we had Kelvin Johnson, a.k.a. Megatron.
I think you'd be mega disappointed so far. Now, I don't know if he's fighting an injury. There's some rumor about that. Nothing that's been clearly laid out to the media, and I'm doubting we'll ever hear that. But his games haven't been as impressive as you would expect from Megatron. In fact, this past week, when they were playing the Jets, there were times that they were using him almost as a decoy. And when you're arguably the best receiver in the game, you should never be used as a decoy. Right now, I would say you're disappointed.
And in fact, I think I heard a quote from Detroit even basically commenting to the fact that Calvin Johnson was a decoy in week 4. Of course, they owe nothing to, fantasy football players, but they want the Jets to believe that he's out there as a real threat, so they have to, put a guy or 2 on him. But of course, when he's active and you have Calvin Johnson, you spend a first round draft pick on him, you have to play him, especially when the Jets don't even have that good of a secondary. There's no way you're not putting him in your lineup. He's a first round draft pick. And he got, 2 catches for 15 yards, somewhere in that neighborhood. So definitely disappointing. He had a great performance in week one, bunch of, a couple touchdowns, bunch of yards, but weeks 2, 3, and 4, not so much. And disappointed so far. We definitely have to think with his track record, he'll turn it around somewhat. He's definitely going to give you some more big games at some point this season. At 1.8, we had Demarius Thomas.
And I'll obviously cop to this. That was my pick. I didn't want to take Marshawn Lynch, who will go with the next pick, and we'll discuss at 1.9. So I went with Demarius Thomas, the second best receiver on my board. I won't say I'm terribly excited about his performances so far. Obviously, week 1, Julius Thomas stole the show. Demarius Thomas did a little better in week 2. The game against Seattle, I actually expected him to do a little better after the Super Bowl performance, but he did turn in an average performance, luckily the 2-point conversion. With Broncos, unfortunately, you only have 3 weeks versus 4 weeks to judge. I'd say I'm a little disappointed, but again, he's on a high-powered offense that I expect to continue to be high-powered and score many points throughout the rest of the year. So I'm optimistic he's going to have a good season, and he'll still turn it around. Peyton Manning knows how to take care of his receivers, spread the ball around, get touchdowns for everybody. So I'm not worried about the future, but not excited about the 3 games I've had.
Yeah, I'd say that's fair. And I wouldn't be too worried about the rest of the season. Like you said, it's a little bit smaller sample size. He had his bye this week, so he said 3 games to go on. But I do remember him after week 3 saying that he's disappointed in himself and he's not playing up to his own standards. So, you got to think that maybe he'll, take a look inward, rededicate himself during the bye week, and like you said, by having Peyton Manning as quarterback, you should feel pretty safe going forward. And then at 1.9, we have the player that you chose to not take in favor of Demarius Thomas. It was Marshawn Lynch.
Yeah, so obviously the fact that he was getting older, he's been a workhorse for so many years, he runs so violently. I was so worried about the injury prospects there, and had targeted some other running backs later on that I thought would help my team, and I will say one of them definitely is. We'll get to that in a moment. Lynch, I would say he's outperformed what you would have expected. He's been scoring a lot of touchdowns so far this season. The yardage hasn't been great, but he's making up for it by getting in the end zone. He even took a reception into the end zone, didn't he? Which is unheard of for Marshawn Lynch. I think the owners of Marshawn Lynch are probably pretty satisfied, especially if you got him at the back half of round 1.
Yeah, at 1.9, I would say that you've gotten kind of roughly what you expected. Again, similar to Demarius, we have a smaller sample size. He was on bye this week. The one thing that I would be worried about, and the reason that I didn't want to take him in any first round of any of my drafts this year, is just what you mentioned, the wear and tear, the number of carries he's got in the last 2 or 3 years. Even though he's looked okay in the first 2 weeks, you got to figure, by week 8, 9, 10, 11, really, right as you're starting to get to the fantasy playoffs of your season, Marshawn Lynch might be wearing down, and so I would worry about that a little bit. But so far, not bad. At 1.10 and 1.11, we can kind of discuss them as a combo. We had back-to-back QBs, Peyton Manning and Drew Brees.
Yeah, I think if you're one of those players that is willing to take a quarterback in the first round, and you grabbed Manning or Brees, so far I think you've probably gotten what you expected. Now, Manning's slightly behind last year's pace. Of course, last year's pace was the all-time record, so you had to expect that. Brees is about on his average, a little behind, but both of them have performed well. But again, the problem I have with taking a quarterback in the first round is they've performed well, but there are another 5 or 6 guys that have performed nearly as well, and we'll talk about that later as we get to probably the MVP discussion for the quarter point. So you used your first-round pick, and you're getting what you expected, but is it really worth taking a first-round pick on a quarterback? Different discussion for a different day, but in our discussion here, yeah, I think you're okay with what you did.
I think you're okay. I'll touch on that a little bit. I'm not a huge fan of taking QB in round 1. I think QB is deep enough that you can wait and you can get, a pretty good player late in the rounds, and you can use your early round picks on running backs and wide receivers. But that being said, at least they went at 1.10 and 1.11. I've seen other leagues this year where Peyton Manning went top 3. Some leagues he even went number 1 based on last year. I think that's way too high to take a quarterback. Like you said, but he's not going to repeat last year's stats. The chance of that is very, very, very slim. So at least there are people who are a little bit restrained, and at least they went towards the very bottom part of round 1. And closing out round 1 at 1.12, we had Dez Bryant.
Yeah, Dez Bryant, I'd say you're maybe slightly disappointed or just at your expectations. I think a lot of people actually expected Des Bryant to blow up this year, maybe even more so than the past, because the Cowboys were, you know, the average team that ended up with Tony Romo being the gunslinger, just throwing the ball around the yard. They've been so much more run-oriented, and their defense, contrary to popular belief, has held up better thanks to them probably being more run-oriented. That, of course, that takes away from Des Bryant's game. They're not throwing the ball all around the yard, so he's not putting up 150 or 170 yards in a game because Tony's controlling the game through DeMarco Murray. But you're still getting pretty good results, so I'd say you're maybe slightly disappointed, but maybe you hope things will turn around after the first quarter here.
Yeah, actually, that's pretty much exactly what I was going to say, so I won't repeat it too much. But yeah, he was the guy that I was targeting in a lot of drafts for that specific reason. I thought the Cowboys would be behind a lot with their defense, and they'd be having to throw it a lot. And I thought that Bryant might, even approach 15, 16, 700, 1,700 yards this year, just given the fact that they're behind so much. So he's had a decent first few games, but I think he'd be a little bit disappointed. But still, I think he's going to have a good season. As far as some later round gems, if people were paying attention, we just went through the first round, and yet you did not hear the top scoring fantasy quarterback so far, the top scoring fantasy running back so far, or the top scoring fantasy wide receiver so far. Granted, we're just 4 weeks in, but these guys are up to a hot pace, and I'm not just speaking total fantasy points, because of course some teams were on bye this week. All three guys that I'm about to name are also the top scoring at their position on a per game basis as well. So it's not just because they're getting the benefit of having 4 games versus some guys having 3. So although in order they were taken, the top scoring fantasy running back through the first 4 weeks is DeMarco Murray, and you should know this because he's on your team. So he was picked 2.5.
Yeah, and so DeMarco Murray clearly outperforming any expectation. Although I will say the reason DeMarco Murray fell in many people's eyes was there's an injury risk. We're through 4 weeks. He hasn't been hurt. He's performed well better than I could have expected, but the injury risk hasn't disappeared. There's a chance later on in the season he gets nicked up. I'm hoping he doesn't. The added benefit that we've seen from DeMarco Murray this year, DeMarco Murray in the first 4 weeks has led the league in rushing 3 times. So I picked up 3 yardage wins, which last year, I believe, Mark, we've looked at that. There was 1 repeat winner in the quarterback category for passing yardage and 1 repeat winner in the receiving yardage, which was Megatron, but no repeat winners in the entire 12 weeks of the fantasy season for running backs. Yet this season, 3 of the first 4 weeks, DeMarco Murray has led the league in rushing. That's kind of crazy in and of itself. And a couple other things to note. Just before DeMarco Murray goes, we saw Monte Ball, Gio Bernard, and we already talked about the running backs from round 1. So I'm sure that definitely the guy with Monte Ball is probably thinking, I'd much rather have DeMarco Murray. Even the Gio Bernard owner is probably wishing he'd taken the risk at this point on DeMarco Murray.
I would say so. He was actually the 9th running back off the board in our league, and yet the highest scoring one so far. So definitely good value there. For the highest scoring wide receiver through the first 4 weeks, we had Antonio Brown. He was picked at 2.11. Looking quickly here, it looks like he was the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 wide receiver off the board. So DeMarco Murray was the 9th running back. Antonio Brown is the 8th wide receiver. He's on a great pace. I mean, he looks to be the real deal. He and Roethlisberger seem to have a great connection. He had a great game 2 weeks ago against Carolina, put up some points. Had another big game yesterday against Tampa Bay, and it looks like he's going to have a great season.
Yeah, I think all the pundits, and you and I also agreed with this, probably had him right at the tail end of the first tier of wide receivers or the start of the second tier. So 8th overall, from a receiver standpoint, that's very fair, and he's just outperformed any of those expectations. The Antonio Brown owners have to be ecstatic that you probably saw people such as in our league, we saw Alshon Jeffrey go ahead of him, Brandon Marshall go ahead, AJ Green, Julio Jones, and the first round picks we discussed. I'm sure many of those owners would consider Antonio Brown now, but not many of them have been busts, other than maybe Megatron so far. But the Antonio Brown owners have to be ecstatic.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, he's putting up some good numbers. I can speak to one of those receivers. I took Alshon Jeffrey 2 spots ahead of Antonio Brown. I'm a big believer in Alshon Jeffrey. I have him in a couple leagues. I like the offense that he's in. The only frustrating part is that whenever the Bears are in the red zone, Cutler and his DFS, Brandon Marshall, seem to have googly eyes for each other, and Cutler just always seems to try to look for Marshall. But I still think Jeffrey will have a good year. Obviously, he put up some big numbers last year. But if I'm being honest, if I had to go back with the numbers that Antonio Brown is putting up, it seems like he's probably the safer choice for this year. And then for the highest scoring fantasy QB so far, we have a guy who's just setting the world on fire, putting out some crazy stats. In fact, before we even get to him, I will mention this crazy stat that I saw on Twitter today. So, Andrew Luck is the only QB in the history of the NFL to throw for 370 or more yards, 4 or more TDs, with a 70% or higher completion percentage, and 1 or fewer interceptions in 2 consecutive games. And the thing that strikes me about that is it's the most contrived, random combination of numbers you could almost come up with. I'm sure that, Geno Smith has probably done something that no other QB has done in 2 consecutive games. Obviously not as impressive as that. But I thought it was only baseball that came up with these weird stats of, player X bats 273 when on the road with full moon, and they're playing in the alternate jerseys. So just kind of crazy when you see a stat like that. But Andrew Luck is putting up some pretty good numbers this year. He was selected at pick 5.2, and he was the highest scoring QB so far. I think he was the 6th QB taken in our league, and just putting up some great numbers so far.
Yeah, and I did look up a quick Geno Smith stat for you. I believe Geno Smith is the only quarterback in the history of the fantasy football league that we are currently in not to be played in consecutive weeks when he threw under 50% and threw pick sixes at home. So, but the Andrew Luck pick, as you said, incredibly lucky, if you will. A round 5 pick. He's clearly the top scorer in fantasy football, the top quarterback right now. And this is why I think you and I earlier said it's nice to have a Peyton Manning or a Drew Brees. But with the depth at QB, you can find good quarterbacks. Andrew Luck in the 5th round, ridiculously good value. There was one quarterback taken in between. We mentioned Peyton, we mentioned Drew Brees. Aaron Rodgers went in the 2nd round, Stafford in the 3rd, Luck in the 5th. There was one quarterback in the 4th round. And I think that kind of leads us from most valuable player to probably most disappointing player at that position. And Mark, I don't know if I ever would have thought I'd say this, but it's Tom Brady.
Yeah, Tom Brady went in round 4, pick 4.7, and he has just looked atrocious so far. He's had some really bad fantasy performances, and I'm not sure how much of it is just are we seeing the decline of Tom Brady? Is he almost done? Or is it the fact that the offense in general doesn't look good? He doesn't have a lot of receivers to throw to. He has Gronk, but as far as wide receivers, in tonight's game, Aaron Dobson and Kendall Tompkins were healthy scratches. They seem to not be too happy with their wide receiver core. They haven't had good luck in drafting a wide receiver in a long time, and it looks like Tom Brady is in for a very long season, and obviously the team that took him in the 4th round has to be very disappointed so far.
Yeah, and to pile on to that Tom Brady comment, the offensive line has looked shaky, which tends to happen when you trade away one of your most seasoned performers and maybe your best performer on the eve of the season. So Bill Belichick, again, smarter than the rest of us. We all know that, and he's proving it again by trading away his best offensive lineman before the season because you can plug anyone in there and our offense will be fine. Unless it's not. And I can keep drafting really good receivers as far back as Chad Jackson, and I can just plug him in, and Tom Brady will make him good, unless he can't. So at some point, letting guys like Welker leave, shipping guys like Logan Mankins out as the season's about to start. I know they call it the Patriot way, but when Brady was in his late 20s and early 30s, maybe that was the better strategy. When you get a quarterback that's a Hall of Fame caliber quarterback, and he's going into the last few years of his career, don't you want to surround him with more talent instead of less?
Well, I have to step in here and defend that Logan Mankins trade. I need to point out that in that trade, A, they got Tim Wright, who I think has had all of 3 or 4 catches through 4 weeks. So that's pretty impressive. And they got a fourth-round draft pick who they will probably, they'll be able to use that to take another wide receiver that will bust and not do well. So when you look at it from that perspective, maybe not such a bad trade. But yeah, I'd have to agree with you. You need to be getting weapons for Brady at this age. I think he's like 37 or so. Instead of getting more weapons for Brady, they used, I think it was a third-round pick to get Jimmy Garoppolo, who they think is a QB of the future. And the way things are going so far, that future might be here sooner than anyone expected.
Yeah, I will say the quarterback that looked the best in a New England Patriots jersey tonight was named Jimmy Garoppolo. How strange is that?
Yeah, no, that's kind of crazy. And it's the crazy part is it seems like the Patriots only want people with male model looks to be their QB. I'm not sure why they've come up with that strategy, if they've done some kind of study to determine this. But yeah, he looked decent tonight in garbage time, but we'll see. Patriots fans are certainly hoping that they don't see him on the field again until at least 2015 preseason. But the way that the Patriots are looking so far, I have a feeling that we haven't seen the last of Jimmy Garoppolo in 2014.
Well, I was just trying to start up the last of the AFC East quarterback controversies. We've already talked about E.J. Manuel being benched in Buffalo. We all know the story of Ryan Tannehill not getting the vote of confidence from his coach prior to this week's game with Oakland. And we've already talked about Geno Smith in New York, Michael Vick staring him down from behind, and Rex Ryan at some point we know is going to pull that trigger and throw Michael Vick in, and it'll all be another circus. It'll be so much fun. But now we've seen the backup QB in New England looks better than the starter. I really think they should give Jimmy Garoppolo his chance.
Can you just imagine if a few weeks from now we look at the AFC East and their starting quarterbacks are Jimmy Garoppolo, Matt Moore, Kyle Orton, and Geno Smith? And I would throw Michael Vick in there as the backup since that's the trend with the other three, but the Michael Vick name just even sounds more impressive. I'd rather just stay with Geno Smith and give you that roster of 4 starting QBs and challenge you to name a division with 4 worse QBs.
I'm fairly certain without injury I could not name a division with worse QBs if those 4 truly came to pass. All right. Well, I think that was a good recap of the quarter point. So again, in my estimation, and you can chime in if you like, I'd say the MVP right now, Andrew Luck, probably pretty easily. DeMarco Murray's probably second. I mean, those two have head and shoulders been above the rest of the league at their positions. And from our league, you've been able to take advantage of the yardage wins as well. Luck has already piled up a couple yardage wins. As I mentioned, Murray's already got 3. Pretty nice to have the yardage win on top of the huge points you're getting out of them. And Antonio Brown, hey, there's nothing wrong with him, or Steve Smith Sr. at wide receiver. You've got to be happy with those guys.
Yeah, for sure. I can't agree. I can't argue with any of that. And speaking of Steve Smith Sr., which for the multiplier of the week, I think he definitely has to get that award. I know that you started him in our league, and quite frankly, if you had chosen not to multiply Steve Smith this week, I would have severely questioned your intelligence. If there was ever a week that was built for multiplying Steve Smith, it would be the blood and guts game against the Ravens. And I'm sure that you got everything that you expected and maybe plus some.
Yeah, honestly, when I drafted him, in my mind I envisioned I will multiply him when Carolina visits Baltimore. Boy, did that work out well. Obviously, the tipped pass touchdown, you can't count on that, but he did hustle. He was in the right place. Great for him. The other, a DB is draped on him, and he still comes down with a touchdown in the end zone. And, of course, he gets the underneath routes. He gets some extra yardage. Great day for Steve Smith. And, yes, I am proud that I did multiply him in the obvious choice game. Now, that would be the multiplier of the week. Now, on the opposite side of the spectrum, we have what we like to refer to as the multipluy of the week. So the multipluy of the week would be the player that was multiplied clearly in a good spot and performed so poorly that you had to spit his name out of your mouth later. So Mark, who would you like to award the multipluy of the week to?
I think this was pretty simple. We only had one really great candidate, and that was they won Donald Brown. In 2 different leagues, we had owners that chose to put a 3X on Donald Brown, which seemed like maybe a good decision at the time because, when you look at the circumstances, the Chargers are at home. Ryan Matthews is injured. Danny Woodhead is out for the year. So you figure Donald Brown's going to get a lot of carries. They're playing the Jaguars. They're 2 touchdown favorites. So you figure, they might be up by 14 or more points at halftime. They might choose to just run the ball in the second half. And you figure, hoping for a touchdown, obviously. Even besides that, you're figuring, in the week before, Donald Brown got 31 carries. But you're just hoping that, Donald Brown gets 20 to 25 carries, racks up over 100 yards, maybe gets a few catches, and, of course you're hoping for a touchdown as well. But instead you got 10 carries for 19 yards. That's even worse than T-Rich, which is hard to do. And then the only saving grace that saved him a little bit is he had 4 catches for 35 yards, but not anything near what you had expected. Odd thing is that Jacksonville, they seem to decide that, their game plan is, hey, we're going to sell out, we're going to stop the run. And from a game plan perspective, I guess you could say they did a good job. The Chargers had 20 carries for 42 yards. Meanwhile, they decided to just use single coverage on all the Chargers receivers. So you had Keenan Allen getting 10 catches for around 35 yards. Eddie Royal, 5 for 105 and 2 touchdowns. Malcolm Floyd, Donald Brown, Brandon Oliver, Antonio Gates all getting 3 or more catches. Philip Rivers going 29 of 39 for 365 yards, 3 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. So Jaguars stopped the run, did nothing against the pass. Unfortunately, the Donald Brown owners that 3X'd them, not so good.
Yeah, and I will say, similar to you, I thought that game plan by the Jags was a little suspect because if you think about the Chargers offense, the best player, clearly Philip Rivers, they have multiple weapons on the outside. You have Gates in the middle of the field taking up some space, causing problems for the defense. You have Allen and Floyd on the outside. It seems like you'd want to try and force them to run the ball with their third-string running back and a guy they had to bring in off the street to be his backup. They went the opposite route and decided we aren't going to let Donald Brown beat us. And I guess if you wanted to play for pride, maybe that's a good thing because if Donald Brown beats you, you feel really bad. But really, that isn't the strength that I think you should have been taking away. You should probably play to the Chargers' strength and take away Philip Rivers, give him less options, make him hand the ball off to Donald Brown, and see if that former UConn product can be the one that beats you. But for those fantasy owners that 3X'd him, congratulations on the multi-pluie.
Yeah, definitely a strange situation, and unfortunate for the Brown owners. With a couple minutes that we have left here at the quarter pole of the NFL season, who, if you had to pick right now, would you identify or predict the AFC Championship game and the NFC Championship game? Who do you think will be seeing?
I'll start in the AFC because it seems at this point in time to be starting to separate itself. Last week on the podcast, we mentioned that the AFC seemed to already be narrowed down to probably 7, or if you wanted to include Houston, 8 teams that could even compete for the 6 playoff spots. I think after another week, I've probably narrowed it down to maybe only 3 teams that could compete as of today for the AFC Championship game spots. I'll say that it'll be Denver and Cincinnati. The team that I'm leaving out would be the San Diego Chargers, but they clearly look like they could be a AFC Championship level team as well. We talked about the Patriots tonight. I've written off the AFC East as of the quarter point and said none of those teams look like they could be in an AFC Championship game. I'd love to say that the Colts could make it because Andrew Luck's so exciting to watch. Their defense has not looked good enough. They just had another hit to that defense with a 4-game suspension for LaRon Landry for PEDs. They had to cut another player for a DUI. Things aren't as great in Indy, and the offensive line still is suspect. T-Rich still is the running back. I think they're still a year or two away from being able to challenge for the Super Bowl. In the AFC North, Cincinnati, I mentioned. Baltimore maybe has an outside shot, so maybe that's the 4th team, but I just feel like if Cincinnati wins that division, which I'm penciling in now, they'll have the one good path. Denver will have the other. That's who meets in the AFC. What say you?
Yeah, I wish I could disagree with you a little bit and come up with a different perspective and, come up with a couple of crazy scenarios out there. And it seems to be the choice. But at this point, I think it's actually the correct answer. I think the Broncos and the Bengals are probably the class of the AFC at this point. I don't know, but I haven't looked at the rest of their schedule as far as the odds of either one of them getting the 1 or 2 seed. But so I'm not going to try to predict as far as where that game will be based on who's the 1 or 2 seed. But as of now, I would say that the AFC Championship game would most likely be the Broncos versus the Bengals.
All right, and what about the NFC? I'll let you lead us off there.
NFC, definitely much more jumbled. I don't think you can narrow the NFC down to just 3 teams like we did on the AFC. You've got a lot of different teams. You got, of course, the defending champion Seattle Seahawks, the 49ers. Starting to look a little bit better after yesterday's game. Plus, they're going to get stronger later when they get Aldon Smith and Demar Bowman back. The Cardinals are off to a 3-0 start. NFC South is just a mad jumble right now. The Saints were a lot of a popular preseason pick to get to the Super Bowl, but they're not looking so good. They're 1-3. In the NFC North, the Lions are leading at 3-1, but if we're being honest with ourselves, I think the Packers are probably still the best bet to come out of that division with that division title. And then the NFC East, we can line off Washington. Giants have looked better the last 2 weeks. I'm sitting in winning streak, but again, I don't think that they're Super Bowl caliber. Dallas has looked good, but again, I'm not putting them in the Super Bowl. Philadelphia, despite looking pretty bad yesterday, I think they have a chance. But as of now, I think I would say the Seattle Seahawks versus thinking maybe Eagles or Packers. I think I'm going to lean Packers. I think I'm going to say Seahawks Packers. I think the AFC Championship game will be a repeat of the first game of the season.
I'd like to say you're wrong, and I will. Well, your logic isn't wrong. The NFC is much more wide open. That could easily come to fruition. I just don't love the Packers. The defense hasn't looked stout. Sure, they had a little better game this week with the offense against the Bears, but the Bears' secondary is in shambles. Not surprising that Aaron Rodgers was able to perform better there, but look at the prior weeks. They just don't feel to me like they are a NFC championship caliber team. I also don't love the Eagles. We saw what happens when they play a physical team, and I'm afraid, and that's always been the knock on Chip Kelly teams, is that razzle-dazzle is great until you run into a talented team that can be physical with you, and the moment your offense doesn't click immediately, well, things start going wrong. We saw it with the game at San Francisco. So I'm going to go with Seattle, because I think everyone in their right mind will take Seattle at this point until proven otherwise. And I'll say it's going to be an all-NFC West showdown again, with the Arizona Cardinals this time.
Wow. I know the Cardinals are 3-0, but, the defense has looked good in the first few weeks, but despite having lost some playmakers. But just from the quarterback standpoint, whether you have Stanton or Palmer, I don't know if they have enough playmakers to get there. Ellington, pretty decent running back. Receivers are good. Fitzgerald is starting to show some age. And you could be right. The Cardinals could get there. But, I don't know. I think it's going to be really hard to come out of the NFC West. Of course, the Cardinals still have one more game against the Niners and then 2 against the Seahawks. But we'll see how that plays out.
Well, they are the only team to ever go into Seattle and beat Russell Wilson. They've got that going for them. I just think that Bruce Arians, really underrated as a coach. Carson Palmer will come back from this nerve. In fact, there's talk he'll be back now after the bye week. If they can be just solid on offense with Michael Floyd developing, they love this John Brown, and boy, does he look fast. Ellington in the backfield looks impressive. You've seen the defense come together. It's Todd Bowles is the defense coordinator. I think he's doing himself a world of wonder. He may not be in Arizona next year because he may be a head coach somewhere else. I really like their chances. And again, we've seen the NFC West, even if you get in as a wild card, when you play those finesse teams like Philly and Green Bay, it seems that the defense that hammers on you in the playoffs does better than the offense that's high-flying during the regular season. So going with that for now. Again, quarter point of the season. Clearly things will change before you and I do this again at the midway point of the season. I'm sure by then we'll be laughing that we thought that any of these picks would come to fruition. By then, the Bengals will go on a 3-game losing streak, and we'll say, I told you the Ravens were going to win the AFC North.
Yeah, to be fair, we'll have to reassess this after week 8, and we'll see how our predictions at that point compare to our predictions at the Corny Bowl.
Yes. So I think that should wrap us up for tonight. This is our quarter point review. And again, if you were lucky enough to draft Andrew Luck or DeMarco Murray or Antonio Brown, you're probably sitting pretty. If you were unfortunate enough to draft Tom Brady, or maybe went with Megatron in the first round, or Eddie Lacy as my partner here did, maybe you're not feeling as good. But the good thing about being in an all-play format versus a head-to-head format is after 4 weeks, you still have plenty of time to make up the ground. In a head-to-head, if you're 0-4, your season's over. It's so hard to dig out of an 0-4 hole if you're playing 12 weeks, knowing that you have to get to probably 8 wins to make the playoffs in a typical head-to-head league. So in our all-play format, even if you've had some poor performances out of your players, you're probably getting a couple wins a week. And Mark, you can speak to this. You've actually been one of those players. You haven't performed great to start the season, but you picked up a couple wins here, 4 wins there, 1 win here. You're not in a position you wanted to be in, but as we've seen, definitely with a couple of the other teams in recent weeks, the Shanilators in our multiplier league specifically go from middle of the pack to top of the table by having back-to-back great weeks and getting 11 or 12 wins.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, and head-to-head league, if you're 1-3 or 0-4 at this point, you're definitely, you're looking at your rest of your schedule. If it's a 12 or 13 week regular season, and you're even say just 1-3, and you're figuring, you need 7 or 8 wins. You're looking at doing the math and figuring that you need to go, 7-2 the rest of the way or something like that. That doesn't sound too doable, but yeah, in the outplay format, you can pick up a lot of wins at a time. Like you said, I've typically been a slow starting team, and then to make up some ground later, which I've been able to do. For some reason, I'm again slow starting this year. I think partly due to Eddie Lacy and Andre Ellington was a little bit banged up at the beginning of the season. But I look at my roster, I'm not too worried yet. I have a decent quarterback. I've got a really good roster of wide receivers, and so I'm off to my typical slow start. I'm not too worried. I think I can make up the ground, and by week 12, I expect myself to be in the class.
Yeah, so again, that's one of the beauties of the all-play format. So again, if you're new to Steel Scorpion Sports, check us out at steelscorpionsports.com. Look through the website. You can find out more about the multipliers, the mulligans, the all-play format. Again, we're Steel Scorpion Sports, a better species of fantasy football. That'll be it for our Week 4 podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. Listen in on Monday morning next week. We'll do our homage to Bill Simmons again with the Week 6 line game. And this time I will win to make it much more interesting for the final week. Sorry, Mark.
We'll see. We'll see. This week it was really close. It was 8-7. We had 15 games to pick. I think next time we'll have 4 teams on bye, so we'll have 14 games to pick. So hopefully we don't end in a 7-7 grip lock, but I'm up for the challenge.
All right. So again, check us out, steelscorpionsports.com, a better species of fantasy football. Signing off from San Diego, Jeff Miller.
Signing off from San Jose, Mark Heflin.
All right, fantasy football fans, we'll talk to you next week.